I've never been one for dramatic revelations. I'm a writer, after all. Life tends to unfold quietly for me. But one night, while I was hunched over my desk, the words of my new novel still eluding me, I stumbled upon something I couldn't ignore. Something that shattered the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my life. It all started with my novel, of course. I'd been working on it for over a year, an ambitious project that I believed would be my greatest achievement. The pressure to deliver was immense. At 42, I was already a successful writer, but I couldn't help but feel that this book, this final masterpiece, was the only thing that could truly define me. My wife, Amelia, was supportive but distant in a way I couldn't quite place. She was beautiful, intelligent, and had a life of her own, friends, work, passions that she rarely shared with me anymore. And then there was Max, our 12-year-old son, who filled our lives with the usual chaos of youth. On the surface, everything was perfect, but it wasn't. Not really. For weeks, I had been noticing subtle shifts in Amelia's behavior. Late nights at work, frequent outings with friends, excuses that felt more like evasions than genuine reasons. At first, I brushed it off. Perhaps I was just overworked, too absorbed in my book to pay attention. But as the weeks passed, the sense of distance between us grew too large to ignore. I started feeling like an outsider in my own marriage, unsure of what was going on in the life of the woman I loved. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, when the house was still and Max was asleep in his room, I sat in my study, my eyes scanning the pages of my manuscript. But the words weren't coming. That's when I noticed Amelia's purse on the chair by the door. She'd been out with friends again, but she had left in such a hurry that she forgot to take it. A quick glance inside was all it took to set my heart racing. Beneath a jumble of receipts, I found a phone, one I didn't recognize. I picked it up, hesitated, and then switched it on. The screen lit up with messages from a man named Mark. I froze. Who was Mark? I tried to tell myself it was nothing. A work contact. Maybe even a long-lost friend of hers. But the messages were too personal. Too frequent. When can we meet again? One of the texts read. I miss you. Another said. Let's make sure we don't get caught. I don't want to lose you. The last one sent a chill down my spine. If you tell him, it's over for both of us. I quickly put the phone back in the purse, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what to do. I wanted to confront her right away, demand answers. But I knew I had to be sure first. I had to know what I was dealing with. So, I decided to wait. The next day, as if the universe was conspiring against me, the phone rang. Unknown number. My pulse quickened as I answered it, my voice betraying a hint of fear. Gregory, the voice on the other end said, deep and smooth. It's Mark. We need to talk. I hung up before he could say anything else. I didn't want to hear it. My mind raced. What was Amelia involved in? What had she been hiding from me? The truth, I knew, was about to get a lot darker than I was prepared for. The next few days were a blur. Every time I looked at Amelia, something inside me twisted. I tried to act normal, as if I hadn't discovered anything, but the weight of what I had found felt unbearable. I couldn't stop thinking about Mark and the cryptic messages, about the strange call. There were too many unanswered questions, and I was determined to find the truth. But I knew I couldn't do it by confronting her directly. Not yet. So I kept my distance, observing her more closely than I ever had before. It wasn't hard to notice the inconsistencies. She spent even more time away from home, telling me she had to work late on important projects, but when she did come back, she seemed off. Her eyes were distant, as though she wasn't really there, as if part of her had already left. The more I watched her, the more I realized how little I truly knew about her these days. She'd always been a bit secretive, but I never thought it would extend to this degree. It wasn't just that she was hiding things from me. It was the fact that she was living a life I wasn't even a part of anymore. And it wasn't a small, innocent life. There was something larger going on, something darker than I could have ever imagined. Then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, while Amelia was out again, this time at a meeting with a friend, I decided to take the plunge. I'd been avoiding it, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed answers, and I had to find them myself. I picked up her purse again, this time more carefully, and I found the phone. It was exactly as I had left it. The same text messages, the same hidden world. But this time, I did something I hadn't done before. I opened the phone's browser and searched for Mark's name. The results were startling. I found a few social media profiles, all of them sparse but unmistakably connected to someone with a lot of influence. Mark wasn't just some casual acquaintance, he was a figure in the business world. A powerful figure. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Amelia wasn't just seeing him, she was involved with him in something much larger. I couldn't put it together at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The late nights, the phone calls, the secrets. It was all connected. The following morning, I followed her. I knew it was wrong, but I had to know. I trailed her from a distance, watching as she met with Mark in a quiet cafe in downtown Los Angeles. The sight of them together didn't surprise me as much as I thought it would. She was smiling, genuinely smiling, something she hadn't done in months. He was leaning in close, his hand on hers, and it was obvious that they shared more than just a business relationship. The way they spoke to each other, the ease with which they interacted, it was intimate. As I stood there, my heart pounding, I realized the truth. Amelia wasn't just having an affair. She was involved in something far more dangerous, far more complicated. It wasn't just betrayal, it was betrayal with consequences. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop digging. I followed her, listened to her conversations, even managed to get into her emails when she left her computer unattended. What I found shook me to my core. Amelia wasn't just having an affair with Mark. She was involved in financial schemes, huge, illegal operations involving money laundering through the publishing house she ran. She had become a key player in a vast web of corruption. Mark wasn't just some lover. He was her partner in crime. Together, they had built an empire built on lies, deception, and greed. I couldn't believe it. The woman I loved, who I had built a life with, was not only betraying me but also jeopardizing everything we had for the sake of power and money. I learned that Mark was tied to powerful figures in the world of organized crime, people my father had once known, people I had never wanted to associate with. In fact, as I dug deeper, I uncovered a shocking truth. My own father, the man I had always looked up to, had worked with Mark. He had been involved in similar schemes before he was killed. The more I thought about it, the more everything started to connect. Mark wasn't just after Amelia, he had been after my entire family. My father had tried to escape his grip, and in the process, he had paid the ultimate price. I began to wonder how much Amelia knew about my father's involvement in all of this. Did she know that his death wasn't an accident? Did she know that he had been trying to break free from the very same people she was now working with? The more I learned, the more I realized how deep this betrayal ran. It wasn't just my marriage that was at risk, it was my entire life. The reputation I had spent years building, the relationships I had forged, the trust one had with my readers, all of it could be destroyed if Amelia's involvement in Mark's schemes were exposed. And yet, despite everything I had uncovered, despite the overwhelming evidence of her treachery, the hardest truth to face was the fact that my own son, Max, had become involved too. Mark had found a way to manipulate him, to use him to gather information about me, about my finances. Max had been recruited, by his own mother, into this world of lies and deceit. I could feel the betrayal all around me, suffocating me. The family I thought I knew, the life I thought was mine, it was all a lie. But I wasn't going to let it all slip away without a fight. No. If they thought they could destroy everything I held dear, they were wrong. I would take everything back, piece by piece, and expose the truth. The deeper I dug, the more my world crumbled. I couldn't look at Amelia the same way anymore. Every word she spoke, every glance she threw my way, felt like a lie, an act to cover up something much darker. My anger festered, but it wasn't just anger I was feeling. It was a gut-wrenching mixture of betrayal, confusion, and a sickening sense of helplessness. How had I not seen any of this before? How had I been so blind to the truth? The more I learned about Mark and Amelia's dealings, the more the truth began to unravel itself. It wasn't just about an affair. It wasn't even just about money. It was about power, control, and manipulation, a world that I had never wanted to be part of. But somehow, I was already entangled in it, and there was no going back. Amelia had not only betrayed me personally, but had become embroiled in something much more dangerous, something that threatened everything we had built together. She had been working with Mark for months, funneling money through the publishing house she ran, a legitimate front for an operation that was anything but clean. They were laundering money from illicit sources, using their position in the literary world to move vast sums of cash under the radar. At first, I thought it was just a scheme for quick money, but the more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep it went. Amelia had become complicit in crimes that could send both of them to prison, and that's when the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. If I didn't stop them, their empire wouldn't just ruin my career, it would destroy our entire family. The worst part wasn't even the financial crimes. What really shook me to my core was the revelation that Mark wasn't just after Amelia's loyalty. He was trying to manipulate her into something even darker. Mark had a way of getting inside people's heads, using their vulnerabilities against them. As I pieced everything together, it became clear that he wasn't just using Amelia to launder money. He had been grooming her for something far more insidious. Mark wanted power, and he was willing to use anyone, Amelia, myself, even our son Max, to get it. He wasn't just involved in business. He had connections in the underworld, people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. The danger they had brought into our lives was real, and it was terrifying. But the shock didn't end there. The more I uncovered, the more I realized just how long this had been going on. I began to trace the connections, and that's when I made another staggering discovery. Mark and Amelia weren't the only ones involved in these schemes. My own father had been a part of it all. My father, the man I had always looked up to, had worked for Mark years ago, when he was still alive. I had always believed that my father's death had been an accident, a tragic consequence of a reckless life. But as I pieced together the fragments of his past, I realized the truth. My father had tried to break away from Mark's influence, tried to distance himself from the world of corruption he had become part of. And for that, he had paid the ultimate price. He had been killed because he was trying to escape the very life that Amelia had now chosen for herself. It was like a twisted cycle, one that had trapped my father and now had ensnared my wife. The realization that my father's death had been a result of Mark's control was like a punch to the gut. I had spent so many years thinking my father's death was just a tragic accident, but now I knew it was murder, a murder tied to the very people I had once trusted. And Amelia, she had known. She had known about my father's connection to Mark, and yet she had continued to work with him, never telling me the truth. She had lied to me for years, hiding the fact that she had been swept into this underworld long before I ever suspected. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a complete disregard for everything I thought we had, everything I thought we stood for as a family. But it wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about what was happening now. Amelia and Mark weren't just playing with fire. They were playing with my life, with our son's future, and with everything I had worked so hard to build. Mark had even gone so far as to recruit Max. Our own son had been drawn into this web of deceit, encouraged by both Amelia and Mark to spy on me, to gather information about my finances and my movements. The thought of it made my stomach turn. My son, the one person I had always trusted unconditionally, had been used as a pawn in their game. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. Max had been turned into an informant, an unwilling participant in a world I never wanted for him. The combination of all these revelations, Amelia's involvement with Mark, my father's tragic fate, and Max's manipulation, was more than I could bear. It felt like the world was closing in on me, like there was no way out of this nightmare. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't let this stand. I couldn't let them destroy everything I had worked for, everything I had believed in. I had to do something, and I had to do it quickly. The stakes were too high, and the consequences of inaction were too great. But I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to make sure they paid for what they had done. The truth was no longer just something I had stumbled upon. It was a weight I carried, one that gnawed at me constantly, threatening to crush me with each passing day. But as overwhelming as it all was, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, and with each revelation, I grew more determined to take control of the situation. I couldn't let this be the end of my story, the end of everything I had built. As the enormity of what I was dealing with sank in, I realized that the battle wasn't just about protecting my reputation or exposing Amelia's betrayal. It was about survival, about escaping the suffocating web of lies and corruption that had been spun around me. The more I thought about my father, the more it all began to make sense. My father's death had never felt right to me. I had always believed it was an accident, a result of his reckless behavior, but now I knew better. He had been killed because he had tried to break free from Mark's grip. My father had worked with Mark years ago, but he had tried to escape the very life he had become part of. He had seen the truth about Mark's influence, and he had tried to distance himself from it. But Mark didn't let people go that easily. And now, looking at Amelia, I realized she had never been free of him. She had been involved in Mark's world for years, perhaps even before I had met her. She had lied to me, hidden her past, and betrayed everything we had. But more than that, she had dragged me and Max into this toxic world of deceit. I could see it now, the pattern that had been set long before I even realized. My father had tried to break free from Mark's influence, and for his efforts, he had paid the ultimate price. Now, Amelia, my wife, had done the same. She had chosen to stay with Mark, to get involved in his schemes, and in doing so, she had risked everything we had built together. It was as if history was repeating itself, and I was stuck in the middle, unable to escape the consequences of choices I hadn't made. But I couldn't just sit back and let it happen. I couldn't let Amelia drag me down with her, and I certainly couldn't let Max be pulled into this world any further. As if the revelations weren't enough, I began to uncover something even more devastating. Max, our son, had become entangled in the very web that was destroying our family. I couldn't believe it at first. My own flesh and blood, working with Mark and Amelia to gather information on me, to betray his own father. I felt like my entire world had shattered. The pain of realizing that Max had been manipulated, that he had become part of their scheme, was like nothing I had ever experienced. How had I failed him? How had I allowed my own son to become part of this dark, corrupt world? It was a betrayal that cut deeper than I could explain. But it was also a harsh reality I couldn't ignore. Mark had found a way to control him, just like he had controlled Amelia. He had used Max as a pawn, feeding him lies and convincing him that what they were doing was for the greater good. But there was no greater good here. There was only destruction, greed, and lies. I knew I couldn't let this continue. I couldn't let my son be manipulated any longer, and I couldn't let Amelia and Mark destroy everything I had worked for. I had to act, and I had to act fast. But I wasn't going to do it the way they expected. I wasn't going to confront them directly, not yet. Instead, I decided to turn the tables on them. I was going to use the one thing I had left, my writing. For weeks, I had been working on my novel, the one I had hoped would be my greatest achievement. But now, it wasn't just a story about fiction. It was going to be a story about truth, about the secrets I had uncovered, the betrayal that had been lurking under the surface for so long. I would write a novel that mirrored everything that had happened, everything I had learned, but I would change the names and the details just enough to make it look like pure fiction. It was a dangerous move, but I had no other choice. I would expose them for who they really were, all while hiding behind the veil of fiction. And when I published the book, I knew the world would start to connect the dots. The idea of using my novel to expose Mark and Amelia's crimes was risky, but I was already risking everything. I had nothing left to lose. I began to write furiously, crafting a narrative that was both cathartic and devastating. The story followed a woman, much like Amelia, who had become entangled in a web of financial crimes, involving her family in schemes that could ruin them all. There was a mysterious lover, a man who had seduced her into a life of corruption, and a family torn apart by secrets and lies. The parallels to my own life were undeniable, and as I wrote, I felt a sense of power I hadn't felt in years. I was taking back control of my own story, reclaiming my voice. And once the novel was finished, I would release it into the world. I knew the media would latch onto it. Journalists would start to make connections, and soon enough, the truth would be out there. But even as I sat in my study, writing page after page, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about freedom. Freedom from the lies, the manipulation, and the suffocating weight of the world I had found myself trapped in. It was about breaking free, no matter the cost. The day my novel was published felt like the calm before the storm. I had worked tirelessly on it, weaving together the truth and fiction in a way that felt almost therapeutic. The manuscript I had crafted was a reflection of everything I had uncovered: Amelia's betrayal, Mark's manipulation, my father's involvement, and even Max's entanglement in their dark world. But what I hadn't expected was the explosive reaction that followed. The book was met with immediate attention. Journalists pounced on it, comparing the characters and the situations described to real people. The parallels were undeniable. Within days, whispers turned into full-blown scandals. The media erupted. The characters in the novel, especially the woman at the center of it all, the one entangled in corruption and financial crimes, were clearly based on Amelia. And Mark? His presence in the story, masked as a mysterious lover, was too striking to ignore. The revelations began to spread like wildfire, and before I knew it, the scandal had taken on a life of its own. As the press uncovered more about the publishing house and its questionable financial dealings, it didn't take long for people to connect the dots between the novel's plot and the real-life activities surrounding Amelia's company. The walls started closing in on her. The calls from her colleagues became frantic. She was being pulled into investigations, forced to answer for the very things I had written about. I could almost hear her panic from across the house as her phone rang off the hook. She had underestimated me, underestimated the lengths I would go to in order to protect myself, to expose the truth. But the truth wasn't just about taking revenge. It was about freeing myself from the suffocating grip of the lies that had defined my life for so long. In the chaos that followed the book's release, I watched as the carefully constructed empire Amelia and Mark had built began to crumble. But as the storm raged around us, something else happened that I hadn't anticipated. My son, Max, started pulling away even more than before. He no longer spoke to me the way he used to. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the weight of his own involvement in all of this pressing down on him. For the first time in a long time, I began to realize just how much he had been affected by everything. The manipulation Mark had used on him, the lies Amelia had told him, it had all taken a toll. He was a child caught in a game that he didn't fully understand. He had been groomed, just like his mother had been, to believe that what they were doing was somehow for the best. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Max wasn't the only victim here. We were all victims, caught in the web of lies spun by Mark and Amelia, and now my son was paying the price. I couldn't blame him for what had happened. He was just a kid, after all. But it didn't make the betrayal any easier to stomach. I had lost my family, not just to deceit, but to a world I never wanted to be part of. And then there was Amelia. I couldn't deny the pain of seeing her dragged into the scandal, exposed for the person she had become. But there was something else, something darker, that I could no longer ignore. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't remorseful for what she had done, or for what her actions had done to our family. When I finally confronted her, the words she spoke were filled with justifications, excuses, everything except an apology. She told me that it had all been for the family, for our future. She claimed that the money laundering, the shady deals, all of it was meant to secure a better life for us. But I knew it was a lie. It wasn't about us. It had never been about us. It was about power, control, and greed. She had been seduced by it, just as my father had been before her. And like my father, she had made choices that couldn't be undone. The damage had been done, and nothing she said could change that. As I looked at her, sitting there, trying to explain herself, I realized something else. I had outgrown her. I had outgrown the person she had become, the person who had betrayed everything we had. I was no longer the man I was when I first married her. I had changed. And it wasn't just because of the betrayal, it was because I had learned the most important lesson of all. I had to choose myself over everything else. The family I had once known was gone. The life I had imagined for us was a lie. And the only way to move forward was to let go of the past, of the people who had dragged me down with them. I gathered all the evidence I had collected, emails, documents, phone records, and made sure everything was in place. I sent it all to the press, ensuring that no stone was left unturned. Amelia's empire crumbled quickly after that. The investigations led to arrests, the company was seized, and Mark's criminal dealings were exposed for the world to see. But the price was steep. In the wake of the scandal, Amelia and I were no longer the couple we once were. I had exposed everything, but in doing so, I had lost her forever. My family, what I thought was my family, was no longer mine. Max stayed with her, at least for the time being, and I could only hope that one day he would understand why I did what I did. In the end, I walked away from it all. I left the life I had built in Los Angeles, the life that had been nothing more than a facade. I moved to a small house by the ocean, a quiet place where I could start fresh. There, I took a job as a writing consultant, helping young authors avoid the same pitfalls I had fallen into. I didn't want the fame, the riches, or the recognition. I just wanted peace. I had found it in the solitude of my new life. As I sat by the window, watching the waves crash against the shore, I wrote my new novel. It wasn't a work of fiction, not entirely. It was the story of a man who had survived the darkest of betrayals and had learned to find peace on the other side. It was the story of a man who, after enduring unimaginable pain, had learned that after every great darkness, there is bound to be a dawn. And in that moment, as I typed the final words, I realized that I had finally found my freedom.